Hello. More and more people have been asking me recently about Mastered for iTunes. So I thought I'd do this video to briefly explain what Mastered for iTunes is and why you might be interested in it, demonstrate how to make sure your music is ready for Mastered for iTunes, and then at the end briefly describe the practicalities of getting your music into the iTunes Music Store with the Mastered for iTunes label. So in a nutshell, Mastered for iTunes is a set of tools that you can use and a set of guidelines to follow to make sure that your music sounds the best it can possibly be in the iTunes Music Store. Because iTunes still uses a data compressed format, AAC. It's effectively an updated version of MP3 at a pretty high data rate, and it sounds pretty good. But it's not perfect, so there will always be some changes to your music. And so the Mastered for iTunes guidelines and tools are enable you to optimize your music for that process. You don't need to do the encoding yourself. The tools are just for testing. Apple will do the encoding from the highest quality files you can supply to them. So the minimum requirement for Mastered for iTunes is a 24-bit lossless file. And if you recorded it at a higher sample rate, they want you to send it at that original sample rate. And this is where things get interesting, because regardless of whether you can genuinely hear a benefit of those higher sample rates, and that's a fairly hotly debated topic, it's not as easy as you might think to make a high quality downsample from 48 kilohertz, 96 kilohertz, 192 kilohertz down to 44.1 kilohertz, which is the sampling frequency that iTunes uses and of course that CDs use. And just to show you an example of that, we can look at the excellent Infinite Wave site. The example at the top is how a sample rate conversion should look, and the example at the bottom is how it definitely shouldn't look. That's from Ableton 7. I should say that the newer version has improved, but it's still not perfect. So the latest version of Apple's AAC encoder will do an excellent job of sample rate converting your material and an excellent job of encoding that music to the AAC format. There's one final recommendation they make, which is that you should not have any clipping in your file. And that's where things get a bit complicated, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. Just before we go any further though, just to recap, the requirements of Mastered for iTunes are at least 24-bit, the original sampling frequency, and no clipping. None of those things say anything about how your music should sound. So they are strictly mastering decisions. Mastering meaning the creation of the final production master. In the old days, that would have been a CD master, a DDP image, or even a U-matic tape back when I started mastering. But it doesn't say anything about the pre-mastering process, which is what lots of people call mastering. That's the creative decisions about balancing your music in terms of dynamics, in terms of EQ, and creating something that sounds great. So Mastered for iTunes is not mastering. It's just a set of technical specifications. Now let's look into that question of clipping. You might think that's pretty simple. Just avoid hitting 0 dB full scale, 0 dB FS, and you won't have any clipping. Well, it's not quite that simple. To demonstrate that, I'm going to use one of the tools that Apple include in the free Mastered for iTunes package that you can download. And it's a plugin that enables you to preview the music through a live AAC encode. Now, it's an audio unit plugin, so it will only work on a Mac, and you need a host that will support AU plugins, audio unit plugins. I'm using Wavelab, which doesn't support that format, so in order to be able to use the plugin, I'm using Meta plugin by DDMF, and that enables me to host the audio unit plugin. And here it is. If you're using Pro Tools, you'll have to do something similar. If you're in Logic or Studio One or an application that supports audio unit plugins natively, you're fine. So Apple call this plugin Round Trip AAC, and it allows you to audition the music before and after encoding. You can choose here the format, and we're going to start with the iTunes Plus AAC settings, which are the default for iTunes. And I'll just play you this song here. This is a track called Leave Behind by Fabian Camb, featuring Krumstoff. And it's one of the songs that I use as an example in my home mastering EQ video series. So I have some processing on the clip, and I have the ozone limiter on the master output with the margin set at -0.1 to prevent any clipping, which is what the spec requires. So let's take a listen. And immediately we notice that the clip indicators have come on the round trip AAC plugin. So let's take a look at what that's telling us. It's showing us the maximum peak levels for the source and for the encoded version. And the peak sample values for the source are -0.1, as we'd expect from the margin setting in the limiter. But it's showing us a 1.2 dB peak above zero on this column here, labelled intersample peaks. So what exactly is an intersample peak? Well, there's not enough time to go into that in a huge amount of detail in this video, but this image here from the hometracked.com website gives a really good, quick representation of it. You can see here that in this representation of a digital signal, there are two samples here that are hitting 0 dB FS. But if we look at the blue line, which is the reconstructed analog waveform after the digital to audio converter, we can see that the peak level actually goes above zero in between those two sample values. That's an intersample peak. It's a peak created by the reconstruction of the digital signal into an analog signal. So it happens in the digital to audio converter. And it's a limitation of the normal peak sample meters that we have in our digital audio workstations, that they don't display that. The round trip plugin is more sophisticated than that, so it does show us those values. And that's what was causing those large values that we saw. But the ozone limiter has an intersample peak detection facility, so let's switch that on and see if it helps. And the quick answer is yes. We can see that those values now have been reduced. But in fact, I think if we go to one of the louder sections of this song, we'll see those values increase even more. So it's an improvement, but we're still seeing lots of peak levels. So let's try reducing the margin on the limiter to make sure we have no clipping at all. So that seems to have done the trick. We've reduced the peak level of the source slightly, and we've got rid of the clipping. Except, look what happens when we change from the iTunes Plus AAC setting to the 128 kilobits per second AAC, which used to be the standard in iTunes. The clip lights have come back on. Why is that? And in fact, why are there more clip readings in the encoded signal than in the source in general? The answer is that the AAC encode is data compressed. So although Apple have done a great job of making it sound very similar to the source, it's not identical. There are changes to the waveform, and those changes are what caused the extra peak values in the encoded data stream. And when we reduced the data rate of the AAC file from 256 to 128 kilobits per second, the changes to the waveform become more extreme. The encoded version does not sound as much like the source as the higher bitrate version, and so we get more intersample peaks. Now you might be wondering, what are these intersample peaks and do they matter? The answer to that depends on the playback system. If the playback system has enough analog headroom after the digital to audio converter, then you're unlikely to hear any problems with the intersample peaks. But many of them don't have, and I can say from experience that my iPod Touch definitely creates extra distortion at the output because of intersample peaks on some material. So we want to try and avoid them if at all possible. Now, if your goal is simply mastered for iTunes, the 256 kilobits per second version, then the setting we have of minus 0.5 in the limiter is enough to prevent intersample peaks on the encoded file. But if we're concerned about people who might rip a CD at 128 kilobits per second, or in particular if they're using MP3, which is a less effective data compression method than AAC, we can expect to see a significant number of intersample peaks in the signal. So let's reduce the margin even more to -1 and see if that fixes the problem. And the answer is yes, we've now got no clipping at all on either the source or on the encoded file. And in fact, Apple's guidelines for mastered for iTunes suggest that you don't allow your material to peak above -1 dB full scale. And that's a good rule of thumb and something that I recommend you seriously consider in your music. But you do need to use an intersample peak aware limiter. If I just turn that off and play you a bit more. You can see, and actually I can hear here, that there is more distortion in that case because of the extra clipping involved. And the other thing to say is that although this song is good and loud, it's not at loudness war levels by any means, and especially at lower bit rates. As you push the average level up, you can start to have problems even with your limiter set to a maximum output of -1 dBs. So quite aside from any other considerations about loudness war levels, that's another reason to be cautious when you're mastering for any lossy codec, to be honest, but in particular mastered for iTunes. The other thing to bear in mind is that since Spotify and Pandora and now iTunes Radio all use replay volume normalization to even out the listening levels of the songs that you're listening to, there really is no point in pushing that average level very hard onto a CD or into a file heading for master for iTunes. In fact, songs with a higher peak to loudness ratio will sound better, and there's another video that I've done that demonstrates that if you're interested. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of what the mastered for iTunes recommendations are and how you can make sure that your music is complying. Just to recap, you need a 24-bit file. If you're recording at a high sample rate, you need to supply it at that high sample rate, and you need to avoid clipping. And a great rule of thumb for doing that, especially if you're mastering at reasonably conservative levels, is to not peak above -1 dB full scale and use an intersample peak aware limiter. So if you've done all of that, in practical terms, how do you get your music onto iTunes and labelled as mastered for iTunes? If you're signed to a record label, and they regularly submit material to iTunes, then they can speak to their iTunes representative and ask for them to use the Mastered for iTunes label. If you're not on a label, you can use an aggregator. CD Baby is one example that supports Mastered for iTunes. And if you Google for Mastered for iTunes registered aggregators, you'll find a complete list on the Apple website. Apple will then check that the mastering house that mastered the music has been approved. So my company, Mastering Media, is certified for Mastered for iTunes. But don't worry, if you're mastering your own music, I've been told that they will then reach out to you and make sure that you're complying with the requirements for Mastered for iTunes. And that should be that. It's not an automated process yet, but it was pretty straightforward for us, so I'm guessing it will be for you too. And even if that's not a process you can go through for some reason, or the Mastered for iTunes label just isn't that important to you, if you follow the guidelines in this video, you'll know that when your music is on iTunes, it's going to sound as good as it possibly can. So there you go. I hope that was interesting. Remember, Mastered for iTunes doesn't tell you how to make your music sound great in the first place, but there's a load more information on that topic and many others on my website, productionadvice.co.uk. So please feel free to head over there and check it out, subscribe to the YouTube channel here, and make your music sound great on iTunes and everywhere else. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.